in the very moment of the victory. He died an hour later in the arms of Sir Oliver, naming the latter his successor in the command of the galley, and enjoining upon all implicit obedience to him until they should return to Algiers, and the Basha should make known his further will in the matter. The Basha's will was to confirm his nephew's dying appointment of a successor, and Sir Oliver found himself in full command of a galley. From that hour he became Oliver Reis, but very soon his valor and fury earned him the byname of Sakr el-Bahr, the Hawk of the Sea. His fame grew rapidly, and it spread across the tideless sea to the very shores of Christendom. Soon he became Assad's lieutenant, the second in command of all the Algerine galleys, which meant in fact that he was the commander-in-chief, for Assad was growing old and took the sea more and more rarely now. Sakr el-Bahr sallied forth in his name and his stead, and such was his courage, his address, and his good fortune that never did he go forth to return empty-handed. It was clear to all that the favor of Allah was upon him, and that he had been singled out by Allah to be the very glory of Islam. Assad, who had ever esteemed him, grew to love him. An intensely devout man, could he have done less in the case of one for whom the pitying the pitiful showed so marked a predilection? It was freely accepted that when the destiny of Asad ed-Din should come to be fulfilled, Sakr el-Bahr must succeed him in the Bashalik of Algiers, and that thus Oliver Reis would follow in the footsteps of Barbarossa, Ochiali, and other Christian renegades who had become corsair princes of Islam. In spite of certain hostilities which his rapid advancement begot, and of which we shall hear more presently, once only did his power stand in danger of suffering a check. Coming one morning into the reeking bagnio at Algiers, some 6 months after he had been raised to his captaincy, he found there a score of countrymen of his own, and he gave orders that their letters should instantly be struck off and their liberty restored to them. Called to account by the Basha for this action, he took a high-handed way, since no other was possible. He swore by the beard of the Prophet that if he were to draw the sword of Mohammed to serve Islam upon the seas, he would serve it in his own way, and one of his ways was that his own countrymen were to have immunity from the edge of that same sword. Islam, he swore, should not be the loser, since for every Englishman he restored to liberty, he would bring 2 Spaniards, Frenchmen, Greeks, or Italians into bondage. He prevailed, but only upon condition that since captured slaves were the property of the state, if he desired to abstract them from the state, he must first purchase them for himself. Since they would then be his own property, he could dispose of them at his good pleasure. Thus did the wise and just Assad resolve the difficulty which had arisen, and Oliver Reis bowed wisely to that decision. Thereafter, what English slaves were brought to Algiers he purchased, manumitted, and found means to send home again. True, it cost him a fine price yearly, but he was fast amassing such wealth as could easily support this tax. As you read Lord Henry Goade's chronicles, you might come to the conclusion that in the whirl of that new life of his, Sir Oliver had entirely forgotten the happenings in his Cornish home, and the woman he had loved, who so readily had believed him guilty of the slaying of her brother. You might believe this until you come upon the relation of how he found one day among some English seamen, brought captive to Algiers by Biscayne el-Borak, who was become his own second in command, a young Cornish lad from Helston named Pitt, whose father he had known. He took this lad home with him to the fine palace which he inhabited near the Bab el Oued, treated him as an honoured guest, and sat through a whole summer night in talk with him, questioning him upon this person and that person, and thus gradually drawing from him all the little history of his native place during the 2 years that were spent since he had left it. In this we gather an impression of the wistful longings, the fierce nostalgia that must have overcome the renegade in his endeavours to allay it by his endless questions. The Cornish lad had brought him up sharply and agonizingly with that past of his upon which he had closed the door when he became a Muslim and a corsair. The only possible inference is that in those hours of that summer's night repentance stirred in him, and a wild longing to return. Rosamond should reopen for him that door which, hard driven by misfortune, he had slammed, that she would do so when one